One life comes to a barbaric end.
It's horrible what happened to Sade.
Another hangs in the balance.
Maxwell Anderson intentionally killed Sade Robinson and then sought to have her disappear from this world.
Prosecutors are unveiling a stockpile of digital evidence.
These videos will prove that Maxwell Anderson lit Sade's car on fire.
But will it be enough to overcome the burden of proof?
It's not enough for him to look guilty or maybe be guilty, or there's a few bad things that look bad. They have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
From the Fox 6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Brian Polson, joined here by Sarah Smith. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
And we are joined by Fox 6 investigator and news content manager, Amanda St. Hilaire. Amanda, thank you for being here.
Hello.
It has been a busy week here at Fox 6. It is, what are we recording this on? I'm trying to remember the date already. It is Friday,
30th.
May 30th, and the Maxwell Anderson trial is in day 4. We're going to talk about what we've learned so far in this case, and also we're going to talk a little bit about how we are covering this trial, some of the decisions we make as a newsroom, why we make them, and how they affect what you see on Fox 6 News. We're also going to be joined once again by criminal defense expert Julius Kim of Kim and Lavoie. He'll be here for a lot of this podcast to talk about what we've seen so far, what he makes of it, where he thinks the defense might be going with this case. And we're going to talk about all of that when we come right back. Welcome back to Open Record. So again, day 4 as we record on Friday morning. Normally we record on Wednesdays, and we didn't want to do that because this will air on Sunday night on Fox 6. It's of course going to be released over the weekend, and we didn't want everything to be stale. So we have now heard 3 and a little bit more days of testimony, and it's clear there's a lot more to come. This case has a lot of evidence, a lot of different scenes. It just seems like there are so many different places. We're looking at a car fire. We're looking at the apartment. We're looking at various places. This morning, in fact, Friday morning has been spent looking at literally pieces of flesh that were found in a playground near where that car fire happened. It's difficult stuff. But the police, obviously the prosecutors, are having to be very methodical about this case. And we're seeing the defense team that has really been, I think that Tony Cotton has had a perspective. He's been poking some holes. It's not just what you do see, but he's really pointing out what you don't see.
I think part of it is from someone who, I'm not used to court hearings. I'm not an attorney, clearly, but I think part of it is the setting up. It's the building blocks of getting into this trial. So it's not like what you see on TV. It's not going to be wrapped up in 40 minutes where they come in with the smoking gun and they, convict or don't convict. And I think part of it is like watching each witness, and the prosecution right now is setting a stage for the exact steps of what they think happened.
So we're really into this. We've been following every step. Can we give just a quick recap for people who might be joining us who haven't been following every step of the way?
That's a good point. So the background of this case, of course, this involves a 19-year-old woman, Sade Robinson, who worked at a local restaurant, Pizza Shuttle, here in Milwaukee. She went in for her shift on April 1st, 2024. She left. She waved goodbye to a coworker, and she went on a first date with a man named Maxwell Anderson. And we know that occurred because of text messages and other digital evidence that the state has already presented in this case. But she goes out on this date. They're out for a few hours at a couple of local bars. They go back to Maxwell Anderson's home, and at some point after that, she's never seen again. And Sade Robinson's body parts begin to surface along Lake Michigan, along the shoreline in a park. The first thing that is found is a human leg that ultimately is determined to be hers. And then down the shoreline, other body parts surface over time. There's also a car that's set on fire that is discovered the morning after this first date happened on the north side of Milwaukee. It turns out to be her car. Her clothes are inside. And near where that car fire occurred, there were additional pieces of her body that were discovered. There are some parts of Sade Robinson that still have not been discovered to this day, but it did not take long for police to zero in on Maxwell Anderson as the suspect, and the sheriff's department was actually the lead investigative agency because the leg was found in a public park.
It was 12 days? It was less than 2 weeks between when she was last seen, and then when he was arrested.
He was arrested within just a few days. He was charged about 2 weeks later. So they had him in custody, but didn't have enough to charge him. But as they were able to comb through, and the thing is, when I say comb through evidence, it's not just, there were these massive searches along railroad tracks, wooded areas, parks and rivers, searching. And it wasn't just one location. They were having to search everywhere her car had been seen on, digital pings that had been requested through search warrants. So they're following where her car went and having to search all of these areas, but they're also gathering surveillance videos along the way. We've already seen in this case an immense number of videos from various directions that captured maybe just feet walking past, or witnesses. You don't see the car being set on fire, but you see witnesses who see it being set on fire and call out and say he did that. And so they obviously had to gather an immense amount of digital evidence. So much went into this thing, and they're doing all of that at the time. Do we have enough to charge this guy before we have to let him go? And ultimately they did charge him with homicide, among other things.
And I think that as we go through the incredible amount of video and testimony, the interesting part of this from a news manager standpoint has been sorting through what we're going to show, how we're going to show it, in what context we're going to show it, because there is a fascination with this case. There's a fascination with true crime in general. But with this case here locally, there is that public interest. But a conversation that we had as managers and with employees is, this is also a human being. This is someone's daughter. This is someone's family member. And so when you're looking at body camera video and you're seeing her severed leg, that's something that we really have to balance what we bring to the public and how we do it. And in an era where everything is live streamed and there's a hunger for that information, it's been kind of a journey sorting through the ethical points of this.
Well, and I think it's different today, because when we would cover a trial in the past, you might be there with a camera all day long, but at the end of the day, you're going to pull excerpts that you show on television. Now it is all live streamed from gavel to gavel, and it's great for our viewers in that they can watch from a cell phone, they can watch from their desk at work while they're doing other things. They can stay on top of this trial, but as you said, once something's out, then it's out. So how do you treat that? What kind of sensitivity and what kind of decisions have you had to make as a news manager in how we address that?
Yeah. So, I mean, before the trial even started, with the way we knew we wanted to have a library of content ahead of time, where people who wanted to know more about the case and wanted the context could go and could get that. We talked about doing a special, but then teasing that special felt kind of gross. So how do we do the story justice, keep Sade Robinson at the center of it? So we had a lot of conversations about how much do we show her accused killer, Maxwell Anderson, and name him versus her? How do we show their pictures near each other? Sometimes even just, what about this text and this font that we're using, really in the nitty gritty, because it's our responsibility to inform the public. And we have the means now through our digital efforts to do that in a way we've never done before. It's incredible. And we take that responsibility really seriously. We also have a responsibility to the family. So we think through, it's like a 3-step ethical decision-making process. What's true, what's transparent, what minimizes harm. And it's really that what minimizes harm portion where we've had most of our conversations.
Yeah. And I'm not just saying, I'm not saying because, touting what we've done thus far, but I do think we spent a lot of time and a lot of brainstorming among us news managers and getting input from various people about, okay, if we title it this way, how does this sound? And so I do feel like we were very thoughtful in some of that. And at the end of the day, we are all regular people too, who are not just reporting on the news and bringing it to our viewers, but we also are impacted by this stuff. So we're hearing the stuff just like the viewers are. And we also had those conversations with staff about, this is going to be a tough couple weeks. And so, as you watch, if you watch, and you need to step away or just shut it down for a little bit, that's okay, because this is hard for everybody, not just the people who are in the courtroom or, family and friends.
You talked about true crime, because there are a lot of people who are really into this kind of stuff and they want to watch gavel to gavel. They love true crime things. But when you think about the kind of content that is out there, when it's either true crime or even not so true crime, but crime shows, drama shows, a lot of our viewers are used to seeing the really graphic stuff. I mean, really hard to watch. But you can distance yourself when it happened over there.
Yeah.
When it happens somewhere else, or when it's fictional.
Yes.
But in this case, it's our community. It's not fiction. And so when you maybe have this expectation, well, why aren't you showing me the tight shot of the severed leg? Why aren't you repeatedly showing me the various pieces of flesh that have been recovered? It's what you said earlier, because there really is a family here that is still existing right here in Milwaukee that is hurting, and a victim, obviously, who those parts belong to.
And you raise a really good point about what people expect, especially through the dramatization of these cases. That also applies to the actual court proceedings itself. I think a lot of people expect that, like, a few good men moment. You can't handle the truth, and this explosive stuff. A lot of testimony is very dry and methodical and factual, and it's because there are, and as we'll speak with Julius Kim, our legal expert, coming up in a few minutes, there are very specific things that each side is trying to do. So it's not always going to be that gripping, compelling soundbite or that episode of Law and Order, but it's what the general public tends to expect.
Along those lines, I wonder how often people expect that moment where there's going to be the surprise testimony or the surprise piece of evidence that everyone goes, oh, we didn't know that was coming. But that doesn't happen because through the discovery process, both sides know what the other side has or doesn't have. I think since we're getting into the legal stuff, maybe it's a good time for us to take a break, and we are going to bring in our legal expert, Julius Kim, after we take this break right here on Open Record. Welcome back to Open Record. We are joined now by Julius Kim of the law firm Kim and Lavoie. Julius, thanks again for being here on Open Record.
My pleasure.
Last week you said you hadn't been on a podcast before. Now we're going to make you a regular. You're going to be here all the time. I know you've been following this case very closely. We are a couple of dozen witnesses in now, a few who've been recalled for a second time. But we've seen a lot of the sort of laying of the foundation of what happened here. But what is your overall analysis? Anything surprised you, stood out to you? What are you seeing so far?
Yeah, I think that the general public is starting to see, as Amanda pointed out earlier, that trials are a little bit of a different being. It's not like on TV or Law and Order or movies like A Few Good Men behind me. Trials are very methodical. They are dry. There's a lot of times where prosecutors are just trying to piece together certain facts that they have to, from a legal standpoint. They have to get in things like date, venue, make sure this happened in Milwaukee County, et cetera. So I think that what people are seeing is just how a real trial occurs. And also, I've been seeing some pretty good lawyering so far. The opening statements I thought were really good from both sides. I thought they were very telling. And the opening statements were very interesting because we got to see from both sides kind of where they're going with all this. The state's opening was pretty detailed. It was a long opening, and they have to do that because they have to be able to lay everything out, and so that these dots can be connected as trial goes along. The defense opening was a little more, close to the vest because they don't know exactly what's coming, and they have presented this or planted the seed to this jury that, you know what, there might be more to this than people realize, and don't only look at what's there, but look at what's not there.
I noticed there's been a lot. I've heard the phrase wrong place, wrong time a couple times, especially when they were going through the voir dire process. Is that a theme that you think is going to be prevalent for the defense?
Yeah, a lot of times people think that voir dire is just kind of this dry process that you're just picking people. But there's a real art to voir dire. In fact, I personally think that cases can be won or lost during the voir dire process, not only by who you're picking, because if you get that one bad person in your jury that could kind of taint the rest of the jurors, that's bad news. But also because voir dire is a time where you can kind of, lay some of your sprinkle in some of your themes during your case, see if people are reacting to them. It's also one of the only times that a lawyer has to actually interact with jurors directly. There's only 3 times in a trial where a lawyer can interact directly with a jury, and that's during voir dire, openings, and closings. So it's a very, very important time. What the defense did in this case was they sprinkled that theme that Maxwell Anderson may have just been at the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's really important because as this case goes on, even the state has essentially acknowledged that there's no direct evidence pointing to Maxwell Anderson being the person who did all this.
When you say direct evidence, tell us what you mean by that, because I know there are terms that mean a lot to people who follow criminal justice. But when you say there's no direct evidence, somebody goes, but I mean, there he was in the text messages. We see he's with her. We see that, she's at his place. So what does direct evidence mean?
Yeah, that's a great point. Direct evidence is basically evidence that's kind of like uncontroverted, like video evidence. A confession, although there are ways that, confessions can be found less valid or whatnot. But I'm talking about, kind of like picture perfect, clear evidence that someone did this. This is the case by its very nature where the state is going to have to ask jurors to make a logical leap because there's not that smoking gun, so to speak. There's evidence that Maxwell Anderson and Sade Robinson were together. There's damning evidence that shows Maxwell Anderson walking away from her burning car. I think that's going to be pretty much accepted by the jury. But what the state doesn't have, and what I mean by direct evidence, is evidence as to who was holding that smoking gun. They don't have evidence that Maxwell Anderson was seen holding that smoking gun.
Well, in fact, we don't know that. I think that's the thing that is most surprising to me, and that we learned in those opening statements is we were waiting to find out, are we going to hear in opening statements now, finally, that we know how she was killed? Was she shot? Was she stabbed? Was she strangled? Was she drugged? We still don't know, and it sounds like we're not going to find that out. Is that what am I hearing that right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear at this point. There are a lot of gaps in this case. We don't know how she was killed. We don't know where she was killed. I don't think the state actually said exactly where they think that she was murdered. We don't know exactly where she may have been dismembered. So there are a lot of gaps in this case. And those gaps eventually are going to catch up to the state, in my opinion, because they're asking a jury to find someone guilty of first-degree intentional homicide along with some other very serious charges. And if there are enough gaps there, if there are enough unanswered questions there, the jury might be hesitant to vote to vote guilty. They might say that, you know what, I think there are reasonable doubts in our mind as to what exactly occurred here.
Julius, can back up just a second with reasonable doubt. So I know it's a phrase that gets, thrown around and it's very court, and defense obviously needs to show reasonable doubt. Can you just explain quickly what is reasonable doubt and what is that jury looking at?
Yeah, that I appreciate that question because that's something that I spend a lot of time in my own jury selection process because people don't really understand what reasonable doubt is. A reasonable doubt, what I equate it to is this, is that there are different burdens of proof depending on the types of cases in the court system. One could be preponderance of the evidence, which is what you see in like civil cases, and then clear and convincing evidence, which is kind of like quasi-criminal cases like municipal violations. But then you have this beyond a reasonable doubt. And what I would say is that's maybe like, are you like 95% convinced in your mind that someone did this? You don't have to be 100% convinced, but maybe 95%. And a good example, there's some phrasing within the jury instructions about reasonable doubt that gives us a little bit more insight. And basically, reasonable doubt is a doubt that gives you pause when making the most important decisions in life. And so I'll oftentimes bring that up in closing arguments. Based upon all the evidence that you've seen on what you know, what's there and what's not there, is there a reason for you to pause? Is there a reason for you to say, I'm not really sure what happened?
I get teased a lot at work because there's a phrase I say over and over, and it's two things are true. And I have friends who have served on juries who have basically come out of that process going, two things were true. I believed that person was guilty, and I believed the state did not prove their case. Do you think there's a possibility that that happens here?
Sure. And that is something, depending on who you ask, that is some of the beauty of our criminal justice system, but it's also a drawback, right? Our criminal justice system wants the government to be able to prove that someone is guilty by a certain standard, by a certain burden. And there are times where your common sense or other things tell you that someone did this. Someone is guilty of what they're accused of doing, but there are certain rules in place and procedures in place to make sure that if you are accusing someone of doing something illegal, if you're trying to convict someone of a crime, that it's done in a fair way. And so sometimes in trials, jurors won't hear all of the available facts, not all of the available evidence, because there have been pretrial motions where the judges ruled that things were obtained illegally. Other times you might have that exact situation, Amanda, where someone might say, you know what, I think that this person did it, but I'm not sure that the state has convinced me enough, or that there's enough evidence here to convince me beyond a reasonable doubt. We want that system, okay? Because we can't just start convicting people because we have a hunch, we have a feeling that someone did something wrong, because that's an awfully slippery slope, right? If we're able to do that in certain offenses and say, we'll just convict them because we feel that way, well then, that could also happen in many other cases. We want that standard to remain the same, regardless of who's on trial, regardless of the charges.
Well, let me ask this, Julius, because some people will say, yeah, and it says right there at the bottom of the screen, he's a criminal defense attorney. Of course he's going to say that. You were also a prosecutor. And I know in this case, since they don't have that smoking gun, they don't have, his DNA on the handle of a pistol or something like that. They don't have a bloody hammer. What the state is trying to do is obviously show as many places as he can. You talk about the wrong place, wrong time. Is it part of their job to say, well, how many wrong places can you be at the wrong time? You were on the date with her. You're the last person who saw her, the last person she had communication with. You were walking away from the car fire. The clothes are still in the car. And this is a key piece we haven't seen, but that the state mentioned, I believe, in opening statements, that there's a photograph. Apparently, we haven't seen it yet. I guess we're going to. A photograph from Maxwell Anderson's phone, if I heard this correctly, that shows Sade Robinson's pants and underwear being removed. The pants and underwear were found in the car that he's then found walking away from. If all of that is true, is it really the state's job here to say, we don't have a smoking gun, but we are giving you enough dots that you can see the full picture, and what reasonable person could see any other picture?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, because as a prosecutor, many times I had to look at fact scenarios and decide whether I feel morally, ethically able to charge someone because there wasn't that smoking gun. And this is certainly one of those cases. I think that the prosecutors in the Milwaukee DA's office, and prosecutors in general, take their job very seriously. They understand what's on the line when they charge someone with such serious offenses. And so they have to, at some point, cross this threshold within their conscience, within their ethical boundaries, to say, listen, I know we don't have that smoking gun, but I'm personally convinced that someone committed this crime, so therefore I feel like ethically, morally, I can proceed with this prosecution. And that's a call that's made not only within each prosecutor individually, but as a team as well, and all the way up to the head of the office, quite frankly. That being said, I'm sorry.
No, continue, please.
That being said, I think that they also understand that it's not just enough to believe that someone may have committed a crime. They know that ultimately they have to be able to prove the case. So what Amanda pointed out before is oftentimes true when you're a prosecutor as well. You may believe that someone is guilty, but you may also not think that you have enough evidence to prove them guilty, because you know that this evidence is going to be excluded, or that there's going to be a hard time for a jury to get over that threshold.
Well, and I think sometimes, especially given how these things play out in popular culture, on TV, in fiction,
expectation level,
people get really hung up on DNA evidence. But my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Julius, having that smoking gun, having that DNA evidence isn't all that as common as people might think it is.
Yeah, that's something that trial lawyers and particularly prosecutors and defense attorneys have had to deal with for many years now, because of TV shows, because of movies. There's this expectation in the general ether now that there's going to be all of that stuff in every single trial, and it's just not there. In particular, let's sexual assault cases, for instance. It's not very often that you find actual DNA evidence or some type of smoking gun in that type of case. Many times, the vast majority of sexual assault cases are just going to be a he said, she said situation. So those are things that you actually prepare a jury for during that jury selection process that I mentioned earlier.
As we all sit here and watch this case, we have to ask ourselves, do we believe it was Maxwell Anderson who did this? And there's certainly a lot of evidence that points toward him. But there's some things that seem like this contradiction. We're living in a time where you have to wonder, when someone dismembers body parts, was this a serial killer in the making? But in modern society, there was enough visual evidence and enough, trail of cell phones and things like that, that they were able to zero in on him. You've got the text messages and so on. 20 years ago, maybe the same person is never even detected. I don't know. But what strikes me is knowing what kind of technology exists, if it was him, it seems like there was a lot of sloppiness. He had her cell phone in the car the whole time he's driving her around. He gets caught on surveillance video. Witnesses see him light the fire on the car and see him walk away. That seems sloppy. And yet he was somehow so incredibly careful as to not leave a shred or speck of DNA in his own home, if that's where this took place. It seems hard to imagine someone who could be so sloppy in one sense and so unbelievably careful in another. That doesn't seem to add up.
Yeah, I like your approach, Brian, because a lot of times when people are charged with crimes, the reality is they are almost faced with the task of having to prove that they didn't do it. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, we see that someone's charged with a crime, and then we kind of assume that they did it. And it's usually a situation where as the evidence comes in and as the defense presents their case or starts cross-examining witnesses, we're starting to see that maybe it's not so clear cut. The system shouldn't work that way. People are presumed innocent, but that's really the reality of what happens in this situation. And you're right, there are these holes in the case. And Maxwell Anderson, you kind of ask yourself from a common sense standpoint, if Sade Robinson was murdered in his apartment and he dismembered her, where is the DNA evidence? There's sure to be, or bound to be, some type of DNA evidence, blood anywhere under the carpets, against the wall, some type of spatter, but none of that was found. And it kind of begs the question saying, listen, can we really convict this guy of doing this? It looks really bad, but can we really convict him of doing this when we don't have these strong definitive links?
Well, and I don't know if this has been brought up with you in the previous episode of Open Record, because I wasn't here for that. But there was coverage ahead of the trial about a confidential informant.
Yeah, we've got that search warrant. I want to talk about that.
Yeah, because police were saying that they had a confidential informant telling them that Maxwell Anderson, ahead of his date with Sade Robinson, was planning on killing her. We haven't heard anything like that in the openings. We haven't seen any of that evidence. It sounds like we're not going to hear from this confidential informant. And how should we be thinking about that in the context of this trial?
What do you make of that? Because that was justification for going back into his home for a second time. And I believe with that search warrant, they pulled piping out from underneath PVC pipe from underneath a utility sink, probably to see maybe there's DNA in there. Maybe he cleaned up all the walls. Maybe there's something in there. What do you make of this confidential informant that we've heard nothing about?
Yeah, I think that, that's pretty strong evidence if that actually existed or that actually happened. But you're right, we didn't hear anything about that during the opening statements. And my suspicion is that we're not going to really hear from this confidential informant. That is a pretty strong piece of evidence. And if the state was planning on introducing the confidential informant or pictures or whatnot that the confidential informant may have produced, they certainly would have talked about that in their opening statement. There are different reasons why that might be the case. Search warrants are different than trials. A search warrant can be based upon the statements of a confidential informant, and then that search warrant is presented to a judge or a court commissioner, and people say, hey, listen, this person is saying that X, Y, and Z evidence of a crime might be in this particular location, and all that they need to show at that time is probable cause. So we're talking about these different burdens of proof in the criminal justice system. All they have to do is convince a judge or a court commissioner that evidence probably exists there. Now, after the fact, they may come to realize that maybe the confidential informant wasn't as reliable as they had hoped or thought, or that those notions were dispelled by the search itself. But I have a feeling that we're not going to see any testimony or evidence from the
maybe I'm an eternal skeptic, but it does make me wonder.
Well, you are an investigative reporter.
It does make me wonder. And does this happen? I don't mean to accuse the law enforcement of having done this, but do they come up with a confidential informant? We need a story that gets us back in because we missed something. We need a story to get back in, but they never had any plans of having someone to be a witness. I don't know if that's the case. That's what comes to my mind when I hear about something like this.
Now, let me dispel that right away. I think that I don't think that someone in law enforcement would risk their career getting prosecuted. I don't think there's this big conspiracy to come up with some fictional confidential informant, because that's what essentially they would have to do. And so I personally worked in that office, and I know how the system works, and I don't think that really happens. That stuff happens on TV and in movies, et cetera. So I think there was someone legitimately that came forward, and at the time they decided to go pursue a search warrant based upon this person's information. It's just that after the fact, maybe they realized that this person might not have been as reliable as we thought.
We do have to take a break. There's more we want to talk about, and one thing in particular that came up on the second day of testimony, and that is what was found inside Sade Robinson's apartment. It's been controversial. It was introduced as evidence. We're going to talk about that when we come right back. Welcome back to Open Record. We are here with Julius Kim of Kim and Lavoie as we talk about the trial of Maxwell Anderson and the death of 19-year-old Sade Robinson. Julius, one of the things that came up in the second day of testimony is when police went to search Sade Robinson's apartment, they were looking for her. She was missing. They were doing a welfare check. They got inside. They searched the place. They don't see any signs of a struggle or a break-in or anything like that. They see a college student's apartment, a little messy, but pretty typical stuff. But they did find a locked safe. And inside that locked safe, once they got it open, they found pills that were suspected. I think they were field tested. They were never officially tested at the crime lab, but they were field tested and came back to be pills of meth. And then also some THC. The defense wanted to introduce that evidence that Sade Robinson had drugs in her apartment. And the prosecution said, what's the relevance here? The judge looked at it and said, well, all right, defense, why is it relevant? And the ultimate answer was, she's buying drugs from somebody who's a drug dealer. That could put her in touch with some violent people. We think that's relevant. The judge ultimately allowed it. We know that an attorney for the family has said this is a red herring, that this was a character assassination, essentially. And I know the judge considered the prejudicial effect of something like that. But tell me what you think about that approach and what a surprise that was to learn about the finding in the apartment.
First, I was personally surprised by that also. It's certainly not a fact that was put forth in the criminal complaint. We haven't really heard about that, and I think for obvious reasons. Right now, Sade Robinson has been portrayed as just, this all-American young woman, and she is, and she was. But there are clearly other things that are going on. These drugs were discovered, and I think it's fair for the defense to pursue that line of questioning and to pursue that, because there is, especially in a case where there is no direct evidence. This isn't character assassination. I think it's fair. And even the judge thought it was fair and relevant and probative and not overly prejudicial. Judge Crivello's in my opinion, done a really great job of being even-handed in her rulings and in keeping this trial moving along. But it's true, there could be more that's going on, not only with Sade Robinson, but with her life, with who she hangs out with, and who may have ultimately been involved in the situation. And so I think that, especially when there's no direct evidence that Maxwell Anderson did this, those are fair areas to explore.
What is a judge weighing when allowing what evidence to allow in or not allow in? What are the potential consequences if, for example, the judge says, you know what, we're not letting this evidence in?
That's a great point. A judge just basically has to decide whether that evidence that is sought to be admitted can make another fact true, possibly true. And that's actually a relatively low threshold. Trials are searches for truth. And the more facts that you can get in front of a jury, the better. But there are some guardrails in place. If something is overly prejudicial, then the judge has the discretion to exclude it. Or if something is truly irrelevant, the judge has the discretion to exclude it. But the judge also wants to protect the record here to make sure that this case, if Maxwell Anderson gets convicted, doesn't come back on appeal and is reversed on appeal because she decided to not allow the defense pursue a certain line of questioning.
For her, do you think that puts her in a place where she has to kind of err on the side of caution? Because if she rules that evidence can't be shown, that she excludes it, is that something that he can try to hang his hat on an appeal?
Absolutely. And I would be appealing that also, because I do think it's a fair line of questioning. Because I'm starting to see also the defense strategy here, not to go on a little bit of a tangent.
No, I want to hear that. Let's hear it.
Yeah, we've also heard the defense cross-examine some people. The state called several witnesses that are purportedly and are close friends of Sade Robinson, people that knew Sade Robinson, people that talked to her on a regular basis. But what was interesting in the cross-examinations was that the defense was able to get out that they didn't know about this date with Maxwell Anderson. They didn't know about it. And so that seems to suggest that, Sade Robinson may be close with other people, but there might be parts of her life that she doesn't necessarily share with other people. And then you couple that with these drugs that are found in the safe. Now you're starting to see this picture that there could be more to what's happening here. There could be more actors involved. There could be, what we saw with Maxwell Anderson and what's in the criminal complaint can only be a slice of this pie, but there could be this whole other picture of Sade Robinson in her life that no one knows about. And I think that's fair to pursue, especially when this is a circumstantial case.
Is that why it's so important for the state and why they've spent so much time and resource on pinning down the timeline? Because while this defense may be opening this possibility, it could have been someone else, or he's the wrong place, wrong time. The more that, as I said, the closer the dots get connected, if they account for all of her time and go, well, where in here was she with anyone else? Where was there time for anyone else to do this? Is that essentially the state's approach here, is to say there's no reasonable way anybody else could have done this?
Yes, you're exactly right. That's exactly what the state is trying to do. They don't have the luxury of having direct evidence that Maxwell Anderson committed these offenses. So what they have to do is they have to try and narrow the time frame and possible suspects out there, and they're doing that as best they can, given the facts that they have. But ultimately, the jury may decide that Maxwell Anderson may have actually been at the wrong place at the wrong time, but he didn't actually throw the match in the car. He didn't actually murder Sade Robinson. He didn't actually dismember her. The problem with the defense is that the way I see it is that even in best case scenario, I think they're going to have a hard time overcoming the belief that Maxwell Anderson, if he didn't commit these crimes, knew who did or was around when they occurred. And that might be something that the jury may have a hard time overcoming. Also, from a legal standpoint, Maxwell Anderson has not been charged as party to a crime. He's not been charged as someone that aided and assisted or was willing to aid and assist or abet another person in doing this. So the state has put all their eggs in one basket. They have to convince the jury that Maxwell Anderson was the person who did all these things, not that he kind of knew what was going on or was tangentially involved. So that's an important legal aspect of this case.
One of the things that I have watched, and I have to imagine that the jury is watching it too, is how Maxwell Anderson is carrying himself in court, whether there's emotion or lack thereof. Have you watched any of that? What are you, as a defense attorney, how do you talk to your clients about what that perception is in court?
I have noticed that, and your client is your client, but it's true, as part of a defense strategy, and just good lawyering, you want to make sure that everyone who's in the courtroom with you, whether it's a co-counsel or whether it's your client or anyone else assisting you, understands that those jurors are constantly watching you. They're looking for body language. They're looking for reactions from people. And Maxwell Anderson has been pretty, not just stoic in my opinion, but I sense almost this kind of disinterest that's there. I'm not sure if that's something that can be controlled. Anthony Cotton, I think, is a good attorney. I'm sure he's had conversations with him about that, but maybe he just, Maxwell Anderson just can't help himself. But I do think that could potentially, harm him, because if the jury looks over at Maxwell Anderson in a situation where it'd be natural for him to emote or react, and he doesn't, they may draw some negative inferences from that.
Can that go the other way? Can sometimes someone maybe emote in a way that looks like it's being it's staged, that it is for the jury? I mean, in some ways, is it almost better to just not make a mistake with something you're doing? And I think the extreme example, of course, is Darrell Brooks. I mean, obviously he was the absolute extreme on the other end, where all of the attention was drawn to him. But in some ways, there's really no attention being drawn to Maxwell Anderson because he's not really doing much as he sits there.
Right. I would, that's a good point also. And, you never want to encourage your clients to, act, et cetera. But, I always encourage clients to, pick up a pen, write some questions down, be involved in the trial, because this is your life. This is you're on trial here, and you don't want to sit there as a disinterested person or part of the process. So what I would think is that Maxwell Anderson would want to be involved in this, especially if he's innocent, to be involved in this so that he can do everything he can to prove that he didn't do this.
Julius, we are about out of time. Last thing I just want to wrap up with this. We've got more to come. What do you expect we're going to see over the next several days as this trial moves toward a conclusion?
Yeah, I think we're going to see some more, evidence. I mean, some more compelling evidence. You mentioned earlier in the podcast that there's this photo out there, purportedly about with Maxwell Anderson and Sade Robinson in his house. That, again, kind of narrows that timeline and the different excuses that Maxwell Anderson can have. We're going to see more of this methodical approach, but I think we're going to see more from the defense in terms of establishing that there might be more to the story than we realize, and that Sade Robinson might not have shared everything about her life with other people, and we're also going to see part of the defense bring out the fact that Maxwell Anderson's phone suggested that he was at his apartment the entire time. Now, I don't know how far that's going to fly. We do see him later on with walking away from a burning car, but I think this trial is on track, in my opinion, to finish by next week, and I think that we're going to see a lot more of these dots being connected.
Well, Julius Kim of Kim and Lavoie, thank you so much for your time, not just here on Open Record, but you've been joining us on our newscasts as well. You have been extremely gracious with your time and your expertise, and we thank you for being here again.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
We will take a break, and we will go off the record right after this. And it's time for us to go off the record. This is the part of the podcast where you get a little more casual and we have a little fun by answering a question that Sarah has apparently pulled up on her phone.
I have a screenshot.
Okay.
Saw it yesterday. I was like, this is a good one.
Right.
Okay. If the title of your memoir was a thing you say most often, what would it be? Now, this one says most often at work, but I'm just going to say in general, like in my house, I say, certain phrases.
Wait, should we answer for each other?
Maybe, yeah, that'd be great.
I'm worried now. I'm scared.
Let's do that.
Now I'm
let's
really
do
Okay,
that.
but Sarah, yours I don't think I can say on the air, so I might have to go.
I
with
can't
a
say.
runner-up.
I can't. Dave, our editor, Dave is punching this, and I couldn't say his on TV either. So
Okay.
this is gonna be great.
All right, you guys go. I'm trying to think of what you guys say most often. I don't know.
Mine's easy.
Yeah, Amanda's would probably be two things can be true.
Yeah.
Well, you said that earlier. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
two things can be
truly,
true.
that's her mantra.
And I didn't even know that was your question.
Yeah, that's. I know. I like that you said it today. Brian,
What do I say? I was afraid it was going to be something like, sorry, I'm late. Sorry, I'm late.
I was gonna say, oh no, Brian's would be like, oh, you needed that by today, right? But I love you for it.
You know what? I'm sitting here with two managers calling me out for my inability to meet apparently basic deadlines. It's because I'm pushing the deadline to get as much in there as I possibly can.
It's
and
complete.
when I finally come through, I'm telling you it's going to be good.
It's a home run.
It just might be a little
a couple hours after
late.
I need it.
Yeah.
Okay, so your actual thing I can't say here.
Cool.
But your runners up would either be Control-C, Control-V.
Yeah, I do
You say that a lot. When you're like, hey, we can just copy paste this. You say Control-C, Control-V. You say truly. You start a lot of sentences with truly. I've started doing it. My husband called me out on it recently.
I was looking to see if in our messages that there was something that stood out, but the first thing I saw isn't something you say all the time, but it's one of my favorites because you said it. Where was it here? That's a next week Sarah problem.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
It's true. That's a tomorrow Sarah problem.
That was one of my favorites. It does feel like isn't there like a John Mulaney bit where he talks about that?
I'm sure.
That's a tomorrow problem.
Yeah.
You have a few. You have a few good ones.
So I don't know. Dave, what is? Well, you said we can't say Dave.
We can't say Dave.
Yeah.
We can't say Dave.
Doesn't Brian
first,
repeat
second,
lines
or
in
third?
Doesn't Brian repeat lines in scripts like in other words?
In my script,
he does.
the
Yeah,
one
he,
that I
like,
repeat,
explains.
there's almost always an in other words because there's usually a time where it's like a prosecutor's laying out their case and then they go, here's the summation.
Yeah.
I lay some things, set some things up, and then I go, in other words.
Or
here's the
you
summary.
go, that's right, and then you repeat it.
Repetition is important.
In other words,
yes.
he quit. But I'm going to spend the last 45 seconds saying all the
I'm going to say it was this much and this much and this much. In other words, that's $10 million. Something where I'm going to break it down.
That was
In other
good.
words, we're out of time here on the podcast. Almost anyway. But that's the best I've got. I had the one where I'm late. You guys got all these complimentary
Brian's
ones.
getting very defensive about
Brian's had coffee.
his memoir.
Brian is fired up.
We don't wrap this now. We'll be late.
We will wrap this. Oh, see, I just wanted to get more good content in.
right.
Now we're up against it. We'll
You're
take a
right.
break. We'll wrap things up after this.
The FOX6 Investigators.
Is
Fearless.
that a gun in your hand?
Did you just hip check me?
Unrelenting.
We don't just ask questions.
We demand answers.
Award-winning in-depth journalism.
We are Milwaukee's investigative team.
Experienced and respected.
The Fox 6 Investigators. Because you matter.
That was fun. Thanks for the attack. It was great. All right. We're wrapping things
nice
up here.
Nice dose of Midwest passive aggression.
If you have a topic you would like us to discuss on Open Record or an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News.
Or
please...
a new title for Brian's memoir.
Yes. Am I ever going to write a memoir? It just seems like a lot of work.
You don't have time.
I'd be late on
You'd
the deadline.
miss the deadline.
I'd miss the deadline. Send your emails to fox6investigators@fox.com. As always, thank you to the people who make this podcast possible. That includes our executive producer, Sarah Smith. Today, Amanda St. Hilaire. Thank you for being here. Dave Machuda, who is running our video switcher, and our chief photographer, who sets up this beautiful studio. That is Cale Zimney. With that, I'm Brian Polson. We'll be back next week.